Hey guys, welcome back, and actually, welcome to the very last lesson of 11th grade cultural history. I know you can say you finally made it, and here we are. We're going to finish up with our Middle Eastern unit. Not a lot of, not going to take too much time here, but it is a lot of content. So try and keep up with me, and let's bang this out and finish the year. In our last lesson, we finished off with the Soviet-Afghan War of 1979 to 1989, and let's look at this conflict. Now, in Afghanistan in 1979, we have communist insurgents or communist rebels, fighters. They overthrow the Afghan government, and they launch Soviet-style communist reforms. They want to create a socialist society within Afghanistan. And of course, in reaction to this, you have this rebellion of extremist militant Muslims. It's militant Islam rebellion that opposes these new Soviet style communist reforms that this new communist government is making. And in order to combat this militant Islamic rebellion, the newly communist Afghan government actually asked the Soviet Union for military assistance to fight against these Islamic rebels who are against communism. And in 1979, the Soviet army invades Afghanistan with the goal of destroying this militant Islamic resistance that is fighting against the government using guerrilla warfare tactics. Naturally, the war becomes an extension of the Cold War. The Americans, they finished their disastrous war in Vietnam 6 years earlier, and now the Soviets are getting involved in a war in Afghanistan, which the Soviet Union shares a border with to the south. And of course, if the Soviets have invaded Afghanistan, the Americans are going to perceive that this is once again the Soviet Union trying to spread communism, and the Americans will do anything they can to support the Islamic extremist rebels in order to prevent further spread of Soviet-style communism and reforms. So, of course, the American government, using the CIA and the military, they give billions of dollars to help train these mujahideen. And mujahideen is an Arabic word for a religious fighter to help fight against the Soviets. The Americans give billions of dollars not only in money, but also in weapons aid, and also they send military advisors there to try and train the mujahideen, these radical Islamic fighters, how to fight against the Soviet army. And here we can see a piece of mujahideen propaganda as the Soviet tank exits the tunnel. The sword comes down upon them, the sword, of course, of jihad. And we'll talk about this concept of jihad later on, what it exactly means. It does not mean a holy war, religious war, as many on CNN would like to tell you. But here we can see this is propaganda by the Mujahideen to encourage people to fight against the Soviets. Now, unfortunately, some of these Mujahideen are really radical, hardcore extremist Islamists, and we'll see what the effect of that is going to be in a little bit. But maybe if you watch the news or you've learned a little bit about the conflict in Afghanistan and you heard the word Taliban, and the Taliban were this, after the Soviet-Afghan War, the Taliban take over the control of Afghanistan. They take over the government and they create a hardcore Islamic government, one in which many things are outlawed. They base a lot of the laws on those of the Quran, and women have to be veiled, full veil. And the reason why Afghanistan becomes controlled by the Taliban after the war is because many of these mujahideen are hardcore extremist Islamists. And the mujahideen are trained to use guerrilla tactics by the Americans. Sabotage was a popular way of fighting against the Soviets, destroying machinery, laying traps in the road. Many of the same methods that are still used in the Middle East today by Islamic extremists to fight against the American military. Now, the Soviets, for them, this is the Soviet Afghanistan. This is the Soviet Vietnam. What the Vietnam War was for America which was a long, drawn-out, disastrous war, the Afghan War for the Soviets is also going to be like that Vietnam War for America. The Soviets are stuck in Afghanistan for 10 years, and in 1989, they are defeated and they withdraw. In the last unit, when we talked about the Cold War and the end of the Soviet Union, this Afghan war is one of the main reasons why the Soviet Union falls apart in the early 90s, because the Soviet Union had been spending so much money on the military campaign in Afghanistan that by 1990 or 1989, 1990, when they leave Afghanistan, the Soviet Union, the government doesn't have any money anymore because they wasted all of it fighting this unnecessary war in Afghanistan. And of course, after the Soviets leave, Afghanistan descends into disorder. The communist government that the Soviets were there to help out and support, that falls apart. And of course, those mujahideen, those factions of Islamic extremists who are most powerful are going to come to power in the government. And those people, of course, are going to be the Taliban. I have a surprise for you. Peekaboo, guess who? Yes, that's right. That's Osama bin Laden as a mujahideen fighting against the Soviets in the Afghan war. We could definitely make the argument that Osama bin Laden is very much an American creation, because when Osama bin Laden, who is from Saudi Arabia, decides to go off to fight the holy cause against the Soviets in Afghanistan, he is receiving money and weapons from the Americans. And later, of course, the dog will turn around and bite the hand that fed him by allegedly masterminding this terrorist attack on September 11th, 2001. Let's talk about Iran. I'm sure you know a little bit about Iran because you have to read Persepolis for English. And prior to 1979, and you see this a lot in Persepolis, especially towards the beginning of the book, where the girl talks about life in Iran under the Shah. Before 1979, Iran was a monarchy run by the Shah or the king. Iran was a country that, and still is, that is very rich in oil resources. However, many of the people of Iran were not getting the wealth and the increased cost of living, increased quality of life that would come from these oil revenues. Instead, the government had a monopoly on the oil revenues, and the Shah and his family were using this oil wealth to prop up their own wealthy lifestyle. So what we see in Iran as a result of the Shah is this extreme income inequality. The Shah and his family are living the high life with all this oil money, and everybody else in Iran is not sharing in that wealth, and they are unhappy about that. The Shah also had his secret police force that he would use to destroy any opposition to him within the public. And in 1979, people get really tired of the Shah. And what happens is a popular revolution that's led by Islamic fundamentalists, hardcore Islamists. So Iran is transformed from a monarchy into a Shia theocracy. And a theocracy is a government where religious law or religious leaders control society. So an example today would be Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia gets its laws from Sharia law and the Quran, and these are religious laws. So what happens in 1979 is that the Shah is overthrown. Many people are unhappy with the Shah because of course, they think the Shah is working with the Americans, and the Americans and the Shah's family they're taking all of the oil money, and the people are they're not seeing any of that oil wealth. So what happens is we have a revolution. It's led by this guy, Ayatollah Khomeini. He becomes the supreme leader. He's an imam. He's a religious figure, and I'll show you a picture of him in a second. But the government is based on Shia Islam, because as you recall in the last lesson, most of Iran is a Shia type of Islam. Now in 1979, we see there's the embassy hostage crisis in which the Americans, now today America doesn't have a relationship with Iran. We're enemies with each other and we don't talk to each other. We don't have diplomatic relations. But before 1979, because many of the oil companies were American oil companies that were getting oil from Iran, we had a relationship with Iran and we had an embassy there. But in 1979, after the Shah's family was overthrown and the Shah had to leave Iran, many of the Iranian people were against America and they were against Israel as well. So one of the common slogans of this Islamic revolution was death to America, death to Israel. And in 1979, what happens was students took over the American embassy, and the people who were working in the embassy were held hostage for 44 days. If anybody has ever seen the movie Argo with Ben Affleck, that movie is about how the U.S. diplomats were rescued from the embassy in 1979 or 1980. And of course, the fact that publicly students were able to take control over U.S. government property and make the Americans leave Iran, so to speak, just gave more support to Khomeini and the Iranian government. Because look at this small group of Iranian Islamic fundamentalists were able to overthrow the greatest empire in the world at that point. Here we can see a picture of the 1979 revolution in Iran. You could see that many people came out to support overthrowing the Shah and creating a new government based on religion, a theocracy, like we said. And here we can see the picture of Ayatollah Khomeini, who later becomes supreme leader. And of course, it says in the corner here, Allahu Akbar, God is greater. Okay. Now, Iran, even though we have a new society led by a new government, and it is a totally transformed society, as you will see in Persepolis, how many people thought that the new government was going to be a good thing, but in fact, what they got was more oppression and more hard. Society became built upon this hardcore fundamentalist interpretation of Islamic law. Next door to Iran is Iraq, and the year afterwards, Saddam Hussein is the leader of Iraq, another terrible dictator. You can do a Wikipedia search for him if you're interested in learning more about him. So a lot of this has to do with the Shia-Sunni conflict. Iran, we said, is mostly Shia country. Iraq, which is right next to Iran, is largely split down the middle. Half of the country is Shia, half of the country is Sunni, right? And the Sunni are the majority. Saddam Hussein, who is the dictator of Iraq, when he looks next door and he sees that there is a popular revolution in which a Shia Islamic government is installed as a result, Saddam Hussein worries about his own power and a potential popular revolution by the Shia minority in his country, Iraq. So part of the reason why this war begins is that Saddam Hussein is afraid of this Shia revolution kind of carrying over to Iraq and Iraq becoming dominated by a Shia Islamic government. There's also disputed territory between Iraq and Iran. Both countries claim that territory, and of course that territory is rich with oil. That's why they want it. So in 1980, Saddam Hussein, he attacks Iran and he uses chemical weapons against Iran, not only against Iran, but also his own people, Kurdish citizens. The Kurds are an ethnicity who live in northern Iraq. Saddam Hussein believed that they were getting secret support from Iran to overthrow his government. And so he committed war crimes by using chemical weapons against his own people and also Iranian soldiers as well. If you read Persepolis and you finish it, at some point, the girl is living in Tehran and they can hear the jets coming over. And those are Iraqi jets that are invading Iran. And we can see that they're mostly stuck in the country and they want to escape the girl and her family, but they can't when the war breaks out. Of course, Iraq is supported by the US and Saudi Arabia. Why? Well, America now has an enemy with Iran after the Iranian Revolution. And also Saudi Arabia, which is mostly a Sunni country, They believe themselves to be the leader of the Islamic world. And Saudi Arabia and Iran, they've always been rivals because of this Sunni Shia split in Islam. Iran is Shia, Saudi Arabia is Sunni. They don't get along because of this. Now, this becomes a prolonged war with no major gains or losses, right? It's 8 years long. And in the end, the United Nations has to come in and create a ceasefire between the two countries. But this war is unique in the sense that many of the images that come out of the Iran-Iraq War largely remember those pictures that we looked at from World War I in Europe, because we have the use of trench warfare, chemical weapons, minor advances, no major gains or losses, as I wrote here. And here's a picture. I mean, if this is from the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, and if we put this picture in black and white, most people wouldn't be able to tell whether this was the 1980s or 1916 in the middle of World War I in Europe. So there are many similarities here because of the use of gas and trench warfare and things like that. Here's Saddam Hussein. He was the dictator of Iraq for some time. He lost his life after the American invasion of Iraq in 2003. I think he didn't die until 2005, but don't quote me on that. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Saddam Hussein, the United States and the West became somewhat obsessed with Saddam Hussein after that. And during the Iran-Iraq War, the United States supported Saddam Hussein because Iran was the enemy of the United States. But in 1990, what happens was Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, which is a very, very tiny country to the south of Iraq. That is, the country is so small, and it's basically one giant oil well. It is so rich because of the oil resources that it has. And Saddam Hussein thought that as a larger and more militarily powerful neighbor, he would be able to invade Kuwait and get its oil and gain its oil resources. Now, of course, when Saddam Hussein does invade Iraq, the United States leads a coalition of a dozen different countries to invade Iraq and fight back against the Iraqis so that they are not able to gain control over Kuwait. And we call this the Persian Gulf War, and this happened in 1990, 1991, when the Americans defeated Iraq and Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein wasn't defeated and overthrown, but he was prevented from annexing and taking the oil resources of Kuwait. Now, in 2003, we have more trouble in Iraq. This is a very fascinating history, and the unironic thing about this is that when the Persian Gulf War happens, George Bush is president. And then in 2003, George Bush's, this is like some 20 years later, George Bush's son, George Bush Jr., is president as well. And the Bushes have always had a rivalry with Saddam Hussein. They're an oil family. America has always sought to exploit Iraq and other Middle Eastern countries for their oil resources. So in 2003, America once again invades Iraq, most likely motivated by gaining control of its oil resources. But at the beginning, and I remember this because I was in high school, at the beginning, the Americans and the British came out and said, oh, well, we have evidence that Iraq is developing nuclear weapons, and we've got to stop them from developing nuclear weapons because then they'll use them on Israel. This was a lie by the government, guys. Once again, an example of the U.S. government lying to get what it wants. So the government lied in order to get us involved in a war there. They really just wanted control over the oil resources of the country. And afterwards, it came out that, oh, sorry, we were wrong about those nuclear weapons. Well, they weren't wrong. They were lying about it in the first place. Now, the war becomes prolonged. Why? Because like we said earlier, Iraq is a country that's split. Half of the country is Sunni and half of the country is Shia. It was only kept together because Saddam Hussein was such a brutal dictator and people feared him. When Saddam Hussein is removed and executed, you have no strongman leader that's going to keep these two different rival factions of the country together. So when you remove this strongman government, the country is occupied by a foreign power, what happens is you see the rise of different radical Islamist groups, not only to fight against the invading Americans, but also to fight against the other Sunni or Shia groups that they don't like. So Iraq basically descends into civil war. Even today, Iraq still has a lot of problems with different groups fighting with each other, and it does have some type of stable government. There has been little stability in Iraq itself for oh gosh, going on 20 years now almost, right? So we see the Iraq war leads to the rise of many of these different Islamist groups like Al Qaeda, Jaish al Islam, and later on ISIS, mainly fighting against the Americans, but also Sunni and Shia radical Islamist groups fighting against each other. Let's talk briefly about jihad, because in order to understand the rise of groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda and these other radical Islamist groups, we have to understand the concept of jihad. Most people have the false understanding that jihad means holy war in Islam. And while this can be true, that's not what the literal meaning of the word is. Jihad in Arabic means striving or determined effort. It means you make an effort to do something. And within Islam itself, this concept of jihad can be broken down in two ways. For Muslims, there's the inner jihad. And the inner jihad is the individual struggle for a person to do good, to resist sin and be a good Muslim. So, for example, this is the struggle for Muslims to fast during daylight hours during the month of Ramadan, to pray 5 times a day, to follow the Quran and the example of the Prophet Muhammad. So it's an individual effort to be a good Muslim. Outer jihad, on the other hand, is the struggle to create a just Muslim society. And by just, I mean fair here. One that is a society that is based on the Quran, Sharia, Islamic law. So most of the time when people think about jihad as holy war, they associate it with outer jihad, because those jihadist groups are fighting against social elements to create a society that is a good Muslim society from their own perspective. Now, jihad has always, as long as Islam has been a religion, jihad has been a concept that has been important to Muslims and the Islamic religion. But in the 18th century, beginning in the 18th century and going all the way to the early 20th century, Muslims start to use this concept of jihad to justify rebelling against colonial powers. So when we talked about the period of new imperialism and the European powers imposing control over different parts of the world, Northern Africa and the Middle East in particular, the Muslims who were living there used this concept of jihad to justify rebelling against the European colonial powers that were occupying their territory. And today, if we fast forward to today, when we discuss this concept of jihad, modern jihadists, meaning a jihadist is somebody who fights jihad, one who fights to create a fair and good Muslim society. Modern jihadists use this to justify defending and expanding the lands of Islam. And ISIS, I don't know, ISIS has kind of disappeared from the news. We don't really hear about ISIS anymore. But 4 or 5 years ago, when ISIS was a peak threat to the West, this is what they based their ideology on, was this idea of jihad. We're going to create this Islamic caliphate. We're going to recreate the Islamic caliphate that Muhammad created, 1,400 years ago, and we're going to expand the lands of Islam. Okay, so the Middle East today and tomorrow, there's a lot of question marks in here. What's going on? We still have this issue of jihadism that dominates Islamic rival extremist groups, and jihadism continues to spread in the Middle East. Europe, even, you hear stories about terrorist attacks in Europe that were inspired by ISIS, or the terrorist claimed himself to be a jihadist, and he goes and commits these acts of violence with the goal of spreading Islam and destroying evil Western societies. Northern Africa and Central Africa as well, where there are large Muslim populations, and even in North America, unfortunately, we still have from time to time terrorist Islamic attacks by Islamic fundamentalist terrorists who are fighting and killing in the name of jihad in Islam. Now, the dirty little secret about this is that a lot of the times these jihadist groups are funded by governments themselves. Saudi Arabia, it's been documented that Saudi Arabia has given incredible amounts of money and weapons to these jihadist groups. Iran also provides support to many jihadist groups. America does as well. We've done that in Syria and Iraq to fight against those people who we perceive to be our enemies. And other states and private organizations will indeed fund jihadist Islamic extremist groups. And then there's always the perennial issue of the United States and Israel versus Iran. Iran hates Israel. They hate the United States. They want to destroy both. Israel hates Iran. Over the past 20 years, most of the conversation in the news cycle has been about Iran is developing nuclear weapons, and we can't allow that because then they're going to use it on Israel. So Iran and the United States continue to be bitter enemies, as well as Israel and Iran. And like I mentioned here, the U.S. is committed to preventing Iran from developing nuclear weapons because they might use that against Israel. There's also the issue of Saudi Arabia versus Iran. And I spoke about this about 10 or 15 minutes ago. Why are these two countries enemies? Well, it goes back to that original question of which Islam is the true Islam. Who gets to be the true leader of the Islamic religion? Is it the Sunnis or is it the Shias? Iran represents the Shias. Saudi Arabia represents the Sunnis. And it's really about this conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran is really about which Islam is the right and true Islam. There's the issue of Syria. Syria, once again, is a proxy war because what happened was after the United States destabilized Iraq in 2003, a lot of those jihadist Islamic fundamentalist groups went over into Syria. And again, Syria is another one of those countries that's rich in oil resources that the Americans want to have control over. And really, what has happened in Syria is it's descended into a proxy war. You have different Islamist groups fighting against each other, against the Syrian government, and you've also got the U.S. and Israel and Saudi Arabia fighting against their interests, fighting against Iranian and Russian interests in Syria as well. It's an absolute mess. And really, Syria, that's to be continued. Who knows what the situation will look like there? It looks like the U.S. is kind of stepping down, but again, I don't want to make any predictions. And, other questions too. What about Turkey? The rise of Turkey. We see, totalitarianism on the rise in Turkey. Libya, which is a failed state. The government was overthrown there, and I guess it was 2013. And Lebanon. What about Lebanon? So there, the Middle East continues to be a hotbed of activity and conflict even today, unfortunately. So to wrap up, guys, one of our original question of all this unit was, what are some of the causes of the Middle East conflict? And we can really summarize conflict in the Middle East as coming from one of these main sources. So first, of course, is the Sunni-Shia split. Which Islam is the true Islam? Like we just talked about, there's a rivalry between Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims, and the question is, which Islam is the true Islam? Who gets to lead the religion? So this is a cause of conflict within Middle Eastern Arab Muslim countries themselves. There's also this issue of European border drawing. If we go back to the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, the British and the French drew lines across the Middle East to divide it up into different spheres of influence. This was later made official by the League of Nations in 1920. And just like European border drawing in Africa, when you draw arbitrary borders on maps in the Middle East where you don't know anything about different religious groups and races and religions, you're going to create a toxic situation or a mess in many places. So the fact that some groups that don't like each other have been forced together in the same country, and other groups that had lived harmoniously have been divided by European border drawing, is definitely going to lead to conflict. And of course, there's this issue of the creation of the state of Israel, right? Most countries, almost all countries in the Middle East, do not recognize Israel as a country. They would like to see Israel destroyed, and Israel itself still seeks to not only survive but expand its territory in the Middle East. So the creation of the state of Israel itself is a cause of conflict, as other people support or work against Israeli interests. There's also competition for oil resources. As you know, the Middle East is rich in oil resources, and over the past 50 years, like we've seen in this lesson, there are many different wars that are fought over gaining control over oil resources in Syria, in Iraq, Iran-Iraq war, Lebanon, even Libya as well, in northern Africa. It's always about who gets to control the oil, because whoever controls the oil controls money, because that's what the modern economy is based on, is oil resources. And then unfortunately, we have American military adventurism. The United States still seeks to exert its influence as the most powerful empire in the world even today. And this military adventurism by the American empire is very much related to this competition for oil resources. So the Americans are usually going in and screwing things up, either for political control and more political power, or to gain control of oil resources. And then finally, we have the rise of Islamic extremism as a result of this is a complex issue, but the rise of Islamic extremism has to do, it can come from this Sunni Shia split, this competition between these two sects of Islam. It could be because of foreign powers invading their country, and they want to get rid of the foreign powers invading the country, like in Iraq in 2003. Or it could also be as a backlash against increasing materialism and consumerism of modern society. Those people who reject modernity, basically, and want to go back to a more fundamental and pure original way of life as they interpret it. Okay. So this is the end of our Middle Eastern unit, and this is the end of all the content you need to learn for this year. It's been a great year. I really hope you learned something, not only throughout the year, but over these past few weeks, talking about modern global history. And if you guys have any questions before the May test, please do not hesitate to write me an email or send me a message on Teams, and we can set up a video call to talk about and answer any questions you might need. Thank you very much, guys. Take care.